Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into Viking Age Norway. And trust me, by the time we're done exploring this fascinating yet deliberately boring history, you'll be well on your way to dreamland. You know how it works here. We take amazing historical topics and present them in the most sleep-inducing way possible. No dramatic music, no sudden loud noises, just my voice taking you on a gentle journey through time. If this channel has been helping you fall asleep, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us create more of these boring historical bedtime stories for everyone who struggles with insomnia. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you want, and let's discover how Viking Age Norway shaped our world one yawn at a time. Think you're having a rough day? Wait until you hear about what it was like living in Viking Norway between the 8th and 11th centuries. Picture this. You wake up before dawn in a single-room wooden house that you share with your entire extended family, plus maybe a few animals for warmth. There's no heating system, no insulation, and it's negative 20 degrees outside. You've probably been wearing the same woolen clothes for months, and your breakfast consists of sour milk, dried fish, and fermented porridge. And that's just the beginning of your average Tuesday in medieval Norway. The Norway of the Viking Age was a harsh, unforgiving landscape that shaped one of history's most formidable peoples. The country itself was a patchwork of independent kingdoms, each ruled by ambitious chieftains who spent their time either raiding neighbouring territories or plotting against each other. The terrain was mountainous and difficult, with deep fjords cutting into the coastline like giant scars. Most of the land was unsuitable for farming, which forced the Vikings to become expert fishermen, traders, and yes, raiders. Let's start with the basics of survival in this environment. The Norwegian climate during the Viking Age was even colder than it is today. Winters could last up to 6 months, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for months on end. Snow could pile up to the rooftops of homes, and the sun might not appear for weeks at a time in the northern regions. Yet somehow, the Vikings not only survived, but thrived in these conditions. Their homes were ingeniously designed for the harsh climate. The typical Norwegian Viking house was a long, rectangular structure built from timber and stone. The walls were constructed using a technique called post and plank, where vertical posts were embedded in the ground and horizontal planks were fitted between them. The spaces between the planks were filled with mud, moss, and animal hair to create insulation. The roof was covered with birch bark and thick layers of turf, which provided excellent insulation and helped the house blend into the landscape. Inside, the house was divided into several areas. The central hall was the most important space, where the family gathered for meals, social activities and warmth. A long fire pit ran down the middle of the hall, providing heat, light and a place to cook food. Along the walls were raised platforms called benches, which served as seating during the day and sleeping areas at night. The entire family, which could include grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes servants or thralls, would sleep in the same room, huddled together for warmth. Privacy was a foreign concept in Viking Norway. Families lived in extremely close quarters, and personal space was virtually non-existent. Children grew up surrounded by adults at all times, learning by observation and participation rather than formal education. The elderly were respected and cared for by the family, as they were repositories of wisdom, stories, and practical knowledge essential for survival. The daily routine of a Viking Norwegian was dictated entirely by the seasons and the weather. In the winter months, when daylight was scarce, people would wake before dawn and immediately tend to the fire. Keeping the fire burning was literally a matter of life and death. The fire not only provided warmth, but also melted snow for water, cooked food, and gave light for essential tasks. Letting the fire die out during a winter night could mean freezing to death. Food preparation and consumption were vastly different from modern practices. The Vikings had no refrigeration, so they had to preserve food using various methods. Fish was dried, smoked, or salted. Meat was smoked, dried, or buried in barrels of salt. Vegetables were pickled or stored in root cellars. Dairy products were fermented into various forms of sour milk, cheese and butter that could last for months. The Viking diet was surprisingly diverse considering the limitations of the climate and terrain. Along the coast, fish was the primary protein source. Cod, herring and salmon were caught in large quantities and preserved for the winter months. Inland, people relied more on livestock, such as cattle, sheep, goats and pigs. Wild game, including elk, deer and reindeer, supplemented the diet when available. Vegetables were limited to hardy varieties like onions, leeks, cabbage and turnips. Grains like barley and oats were grown and used to make bread and porridge. The preparation of food was a time-consuming and labour-intensive process. Women typically handled most of the cooking and food preparation, though men might help with tasks like butchering animals or smoking fish. Cooking was done over the open fire in the central hall, using iron pots suspended from chains over the flames. Baking was done in special ovens built into the walls or in separate buildings. The preparation of fermented dairy products required careful attention to temperature and timing, as spoilage could result in sickness or death. Personal hygiene in Viking Norway was better than many people imagine, though still far from modern standards. The Vikings valued cleanliness and took regular baths, though this was often a communal activity. They used a type of soap made from animal fat and ash, which was surprisingly effective. However, bathing in winter was a challenge, as water had to be heated over the fire, and bathing areas had to be warm enough to prevent hypothermia. Many Vikings visited hot springs when available, as these provided a warm and relaxing bathing experience even in the coldest weather. Clothing was primarily made from wool and linen, materials that were well suited to the cold climate. Sheep were raised not just for meat and milk, but also for their wool, which was spun, dyed, and woven into fabric. Linen was made from flax, which was grown in small quantities in areas with suitable soil. Fur and leather from various animals were used for warm outer garments and shoes. Clothing was typically layered, with multiple garments worn on top of each other for insulation. The process of making clothing was extremely labour-intensive. Sheep had to be sheared, the wool cleaned and combed, then spun into thread using a spindle. The thread was then woven on a loom to create fabric. Dyeing was done using various plants and minerals to achieve different colours. Finally, the fabric was cut and sewn into garments using bone needles and thread. A single outfit could take weeks or months to complete, depending on its complexity. Healthcare in Viking Norway was primitive by modern standards, but not entirely ineffective. The Vikings had a tradition of herbal medicine, using various plants to treat ailments. They also practiced basic surgery, including setting bones and treating wounds. However, many conditions that we consider minor today could be fatal in Viking times. Infection, disease, and complications from childbirth were common causes of death. The harsh climate and physical demands of daily life meant that many people didn't live beyond their 30s or 40s. The social structure of Viking Norwegian society was complex and hierarchical. At the top were the jarls, powerful chieftains who controlled large territories and led raids. Below them were the carls, free farmers, and craftsmen who formed the backbone of society. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage, who performed the most menial and dangerous tasks. Women, while not equal to men in terms of legal rights, had more freedom and influence than in many other medieval societies. The role of women in Viking Norwegian society was multifaceted and important. They were responsible for managing the household, which included overseeing food preparation, textile production, and child rearing. Women also had legal rights, including the ability to own property, request divorces, and carry weapons for self-defense. Some women became successful merchants, trading goods across Scandinavia and beyond. Others gained fame as seeresses or healers, roles that were highly respected in Viking society. Children in Viking Norway faced a precarious existence. Infant mortality was extremely high, with many children dying before their first birthday. Those who survived faced the constant threat of disease, accidents, and malnutrition. Education was largely informal, with children learning by watching and helping adults. Boys learned farming, hunting, and fighting skills, while girls learned domestic tasks like cooking, weaving, and childcare. Children were expected to contribute to the household from a young age, performing tasks according to their ability. The agricultural year in Viking Norway was short and intense. The growing season lasted only a few months, from spring through early fall. During this time, families worked from dawn to dusk to plant, tend, and harvest their crops. The entire family participated in agricultural work, with even young children helping with tasks like weeding and harvesting. The yield had to last through the long winter months, so careful planning and hard work were essential for survival. Animal husbandry was equally important to the Viking economy. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were raised for meat, milk, and other products. Horses were valuable for transportation and warfare, though they were less common in Norway than in other parts of Scandinavia. During the winter, animals had to be fed with hay and other fodder that had been collected during the summer. The survival of the animals was often as precarious as that of the humans, and a harsh winter could devastate a family's livestock. The art of war was an integral part of Viking culture in Norway. Young men were expected to learn how to fight from an early age, training with weapons like swords, axes, spears, and bows. Warfare was not just about physical prowess, but also about strategy, courage, and honour. The concept of dying in battle and going to Valhalla was central to Viking belief, though this is often exaggerated in popular culture. Most Vikings were farmers and traders first, warriors second, turning to violence only when necessary or when the opportunity for profitable raiding arose. The technological knowledge of the Vikings was impressive for their time. They were skilled metalworkers, creating weapons, tools, and jewellery from iron, bronze, and precious metals. Their shipbuilding techniques were advanced, allowing them to create vessels that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. They were also accomplished woodworkers, stone carvers, and textile producers. However, these skills were learned through apprenticeship and passed down through families with no formal education or written records. Trade was a vital part of the Viking economy in Norway. Norwegian Vikings traded with people throughout Scandinavia, Europe, and even as far as Constantinople and Baghdad. They exported furs, amber, iron, and soapstone, while importing goods like silk, spices, silver, and exotic foods. Trade routes were often dangerous, with pirates, political conflicts, and natural hazards posing constant threats. Despite these challenges, successful traders could accumulate considerable wealth and influence. The religious beliefs of the Vikings were complex and varied. The Old Norse religion centered around a pantheon of gods, led by Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Religious practices included sacrifices, both animal and human, performed at special temples and during important festivals. The Vikings also believed in a variety of supernatural beings, including trolls, elves, and spirits that inhabited the natural world. However, as Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, many Vikings adopted the new religion, often combining it with their traditional beliefs. The legal system in Viking Norway was based on assemblies called things, where free men gathered to settle disputes and make decisions. These assemblies were democratic in nature, with all free men having the right to speak and vote. The law was primarily oral, passed down through tradition and memory rather than written codes. Punishments for crimes ranged from fines and compensation to banishment and death. The concept of feud and blood revenge was also important, with families obligated to avenge wrongs done to their members. Entertainment and storytelling were crucial aspects of Viking life, especially during the long winter months. Professional storytellers, called skalds, would recite epic poems and stories about gods, heroes, and legendary battles. Music was also important, with Vikings playing instruments like harps, flutes, and drums. Board games, gambling, and contests of strength and skill were popular pastimes. These activities helped pass the time during the winter months and preserve cultural traditions and values. The Viking Age in Norway was a time of significant change and development. The country was gradually unified under a single king, though this process took several centuries and was often violent. New technologies and ideas were adopted from contact with other cultures through trade and raid. The conversion to Christianity brought major changes to social structures, laws, and cultural practices. Despite these changes, many aspects of traditional Viking life continued well into the medieval period. The construction of Viking ships represented one of the most significant technological achievements of the era. These vessels, known as longships, were marvels of engineering that allowed the Vikings to travel vast distances across both sea and river. The ships were built using a technique called clinker construction, where overlapping planks were riveted together to create a flexible yet strong hull. The shallow draft of these ships allowed them to navigate rivers and make beach landings, giving Vikings tremendous strategic advantages in warfare and trade. Building a longship required a team of skilled craftsmen and could take months or even years to complete. The typical Viking longship crew faced numerous challenges during voyages. Weather was unpredictable and often dangerous, with sudden storms capable of sinking even the most well-built vessels. Navigation relied on the position of the sun, stars, and knowledge of wind patterns and currents. Food and water had to be carefully rationed, as space was limited and voyages could last weeks or months. Crew members took turns rowing and sailing, with everyone expected to contribute to the vessel's operation, regardless of their usual role in society. The impact of raiding on Viking Norwegian society was profound and complex. While raiding brought wealth and resources to communities, it also exposed them to retaliation and conflict. Successful raids could elevate a chieftain's status and attract followers, but failed expeditions could result in death, slavery, or financial ruin. The wealth gained from raiding was often invested in land, livestock, and crafted goods, contributing to social stratification. However, not all Vikings participated in raiding. Many lived peaceful lives as farmers, merchants, and craftspeople. The process of metalworking in Viking Norway required considerable skill and resources. Iron was extracted from bog ore, a type of iron deposit found in wetlands throughout Scandinavia. The ore had to be heated in furnaces to high temperatures to separate the iron from impurities. Blacksmiths then worked the hot iron with hammers and anvils to create tools, weapons, and household items. More precious metals like silver and gold were used for jewellery and decorative objects, often incorporating intricate patterns and designs inspired by Norse mythology. Music and poetry held special significance in Viking culture, serving both entertainment and historical preservation functions. Skalds, or court poets, were highly respected figures who composed and memorized complex verses about heroes, battles, and gods. These poems, known as skaldic poetry, used intricate metaphors and kennings that required extensive knowledge to understand fully. Musical instruments included harps, lutes, horns, and various percussion instruments made from wood, bone, and metal. Singing and playing music were common activities during feasts, religious ceremonies, and long winter evenings. The treatment of the deceased in Viking Norway reflected complex beliefs about the afterlife. Burial practices varied depending on wealth, status, and regional customs. Wealthy individuals might be buried with ships, weapons, jewellery, and even servants to accompany them to the next world. Cremation was also common, with ashes sometimes placed in urns or scattered in significant locations. The famous burial mounds, found throughout Norway, contain rich grave goods that provide insights into Viking beliefs and social structures. The transition from paganism to Christianity in Viking Norway was gradual and often tumultuous. Christian missionaries faced considerable resistance from those who held firmly to the old beliefs. King Olaf I and later King Olaf II played crucial roles in the conversion process, sometimes using force to impose Christianity. Many Vikings initially adopted a syncretic approach, combining Christian elements with traditional Norse practices. The building of the first churches and the introduction of written law based on Christian principles marked significant cultural shifts in Norwegian society. Viking exploration and settlement extended far beyond Norway's borders, with expeditions reaching as far as North America. Eric the Red established settlements in Greenland after being exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. His son Leif Erikson is credited with being the first European to set foot in North America, establishing a short-lived settlement in what is now Newfoundland. These Western explorations were driven by a combination of factors, including overpopulation, political conflict, and the desire for new opportunities. However, the harsh conditions and conflicts with indigenous peoples meant that most of these Western settlements were eventually abandoned. As time passed and we move into the period where Norwegian Vikings began to encounter new challenges and opportunities that would shape their society for generations to come. The coastal settlements grew more sophisticated as trade connections expanded beyond Scandinavia. Merchants established regular routes to the British Isles, bringing back not only silver and goods, but also new ideas about governance, religion, and craftsmanship. The influence of these foreign contacts began to permeate Norwegian society, creating tension between traditional ways and emerging new customs. The role of the marketplace became increasingly important in Viking Norwegian communities. Weekly or monthly markets brought together people from surrounding areas to exchange goods, news, and stories. These gatherings served multiple functions beyond commerce, acting as social events, matchmaking opportunities, and centres for political discussion. Craftsmen would display their wares, farmers would sell surplus produce, and traders would offer exotic goods from distant lands. The success of these markets often determined the prosperity of entire regions. The evolution of weaponry during this period reflected both technological advances and changing warfare tactics. The traditional Viking sword, with its pattern-welded construction, remained a symbol of status and honour. However, improvements in metallurgy led to stronger, sharper blades that could penetrate chainmail more effectively. Axes became more specialised, with some designed specifically for war and others for practical use. The development of crossbows and improved archery techniques began to change the nature of Viking combat, making mass formations and sieges more common. Clothing styles in Viking Norway began to show influences from contact with other cultures. Wealthy Vikings started incorporating silk garments and decorative elements from Byzantine and Islamic sources. The use of buttons, which had been rare in early Viking times, became more common as trade brought new fastening techniques. Colour preferences expanded beyond natural dyes to include exotic pigments that produced brilliant reds, purples and greens. These fashion changes often created social tensions, as traditionalists viewed foreign styles as threats to Norwegian identity. The agricultural practices of Viking Norway underwent gradual but significant changes. New crops introduced through trade and raid began to supplement traditional staples. The three-field system of crop rotation, learned from contact with other European societies, improved yields and soil fertility. Better ploughing techniques and iron tools increased productivity, allowing communities to support larger populations. However, these improvements were often offset by political instability and the demands of warfare, which pulled workers away from the fields. The development of written law codes marked a crucial transition in Norwegian society. The Gulleting and Frostating laws, though initially oral traditions, began to be recorded in writing during the late Viking period. These codes attempted to codify traditional practices while incorporating Christian principles. The process of writing down laws reduced regional variations, but also led to conflicts between different legal traditions. Literacy remained rare, with only clergy and some nobles able to read and write, creating a power imbalance between those who understood the written law and those who relied on memory and tradition. The construction techniques for houses evolved to reflect both practical needs and increased wealth. Wealthier families began building larger halls with separate rooms for different functions. The addition of second stories became more common, though this required more sophisticated construction methods. Windows, initially just openings in walls, began to feature shutters and eventually primitive glass made from clear amber or thin sheets of ice. The development of better chimneys and smoke management systems made indoor air quality somewhat more bearable, though houses remained smoky and poorly ventilated by modern standards. The emergence of professional crafts guilds began to change how skilled work was organised. Blacksmiths, shipwrights, and other specialists started forming associations to regulate quality, prices, and training. These early guilds established apprenticeship systems that formalised the transfer of knowledge from master to student. However, guild membership was often restricted, creating barriers for outsiders and potentially stifling innovation. The tension between traditional family-based craft transmission and these new organised systems created social friction in many communities. Medical knowledge in Viking Norway expanded through contact with other cultures, though superstition and religion continued to play important roles. The introduction of continental European medical texts brought new ideas about anatomy and disease. Monastic institutions began to establish infirmaries that combined religious healing with practical medicine. Knowledge of herbal remedies expanded as traders brought new plants and preparation techniques from abroad. However, many ailments remained fatal, and the average lifespan showed little improvement despite these medical advances. The development of fish processing industries had profound effects on Norwegian coastal communities. Improved techniques for drying, salting, and smoking fish allowed for longer-term storage and expanded trade opportunities. The discovery that cod could be air-dried without salt in the cold Norwegian climate revolutionized the fishing industry. This led to the establishment of fishing stations where seasonal workers would gather for the annual cod run. The wealth generated from fish exports helped finance ships, weapons, and imported goods, contributing to Norway's growing influence in Scandinavia. The evolution of political structures from tribal chieftains to regional kingdoms created both opportunities and challenges. Ambitious leaders consolidated power by forming alliances, conquering rivals, and establishing stronger administrative systems. The need for regular taxation to support courts and armies led to the development of more systematic record-keeping. However, centralisation often met resistance from local leaders who valued their traditional autonomy. The balance between local customs and royal authority remained a source of ongoing tension throughout the Viking period. Religious practices underwent significant transformation as Christianity gained influence. The construction of the first stone churches required new architectural knowledge and enormous resources. Christian festivals began to replace or merge with traditional Norse celebrations, creating hybrid religious practices. The introduction of the tithe system required communities to allocate portions of their production to support religious institutions. Conflicts between Christian and pagan communities sometimes erupted into violence, as each group struggled to maintain their beliefs and practices. The expansion of slavery in Viking society created a large underclass whose labour supported the elite lifestyle. Thralls captured in raids were put to work in fields, households, and dangerous occupations like mining. The slave trade became a significant economic activity, with regular markets where humans were bought and sold like livestock. Some thralls could earn or buy their freedom, but most remained enslaved for life. The dependence on slave labour created moral contradictions in a society that claimed to value honour and individual worth. The development of more sophisticated burial practices reflected changing beliefs about death and social status. Elaborate burial ships became symbols of ultimate wealth and power, requiring enormous resources to construct and provision. The practice of sacrificing humans to accompany the dead in the afterlife became more elaborate, with specific rituals and ceremonies. Grave goods became more diverse and valuable, including imported artifacts that demonstrated the deceased's connections to distant lands. These expensive funeral practices sometimes caused financial hardship for families, who felt obligated to honour their dead according to social expectations. The role of women in Viking society began to shift as Norwegian communities became more stratified. While women retained many of their traditional rights, the influence of Christianity brought new restrictions and expectations. The rise of professional craftsmen meant that some traditionally female occupations became male-dominated trades. However, women continued to play important roles in trade, especially in markets and domestic industries like textile production. Wealthy women gained new opportunities to patronize religious institutions and influence political decisions through their holdings and connections. Educational systems in Viking Norway remained largely informal, but began to show signs of organisation. The establishment of cathedral schools provided basic literacy education for future clergy. Wealthy families began hiring tutors or sending children to be educated in other courts. The preservation of oral traditions through formal storytelling ceremonies became more structured. However, the vast majority of the population remained illiterate, relying on memory and oral transmission for knowledge. The transformation of Norwegian landscapes through human activity accelerated during this period. Extensive clearing of forests for agriculture, shipbuilding, and fuel changed the appearance of many regions. The construction of roads and bridges improved transportation, but required significant community labour. Mining operations for iron, copper, and other metals created new settlements in previously uninhabited areas. These environmental changes had long-term consequences for wildlife, climate, and the sustainability of human communities. The development of more complex trade relationships led to the establishment of permanent trading posts. These settlements served as bridges between different cultural groups and facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Professional merchants began to establish networks that spanned multiple kingdoms and regions. The use of standardized weights and measures made trade more efficient, but also created disputes when different systems conflicted. Credit systems and delayed payment arrangements allowed for more complex commercial relationships, but also increased the risk of fraud and default. The influence of continental European political ideas began to penetrate Norwegian society. Concepts of feudalism and hierarchical land ownership challenged traditional Norwegian systems of property rights. The idea of professional armies controlled by rulers, rather than warrior farmers, began to gain acceptance. Legal concepts borrowed from Roman law started to influence Norwegian judicial practices. However, these foreign ideas often clashed with established customs, creating confusion and conflict in legal proceedings. The rise of fortified settlements reflected increasing concerns about security and defence. Instead of relying solely on natural obstacles, communities began building walls, ditches, and watchtowers. The construction of these fortifications required coordinated effort and demonstrated the growing power of local leaders. Stone construction techniques, learned from contact with other European societies, allowed for more permanent and impressive defensive structures. However, the maintenance of these fortifications placed an ongoing burden on communities already struggling with agricultural demands. The evolution of entertainment and leisure activities reflected changing social structures and values. Board games became more elaborate and sophisticated, with rules and pieces that demonstrated wealth and status. Musical instruments imported from other cultures expanded the range of sounds available to Norwegian musicians. Competitive sports and contests became more organised, with formal rules and prizes. The growth of poetry and storytelling created a distinct Norwegian literary tradition that would influence later cultural development. The transition from a predominantly pagan to a Christian society created profound changes in daily life. The Christian calendar imposed new rhythms on work and rest, with Sunday becoming a day of worship and reduced labour. Dietary restrictions and fasting periods changed eating habits and food production patterns. Marriage customs evolved to incorporate Christian ceremonies while retaining some traditional elements. The establishment of Christian burial grounds changed the relationship between communities and their dead ancestors. Technological innovations continued to transform daily life in Norwegian communities. Water-powered mills began to appear, reducing the labour required for grinding grain. Improvements in brewing techniques led to better beer and stronger alcoholic beverages. The development of more efficient looms and spinning wheels increased textile production. However, these technological advances were not evenly distributed, creating disparities between communities that had access to new tools and those that did not. The changing nature of Viking raids reflected broader shifts in Norwegian society and European politics. As potential targets became better defended, raids required larger forces and more sophisticated planning. The focus shifted from quick smash-and-grab operations to longer campaigns aimed at conquest and settlement. Political alliances with foreign rulers sometimes replaced outright hostility with more complex diplomatic relationships. The rise of professional armies and fortified positions made traditional Viking tactics less effective, forcing adaptations in warfare methods. The development of more sophisticated financial systems began to transform economic relationships. The use of silver by weight as a medium of exchange became more standardized across regions. Simple banking functions such as money lending and foreign exchange began to emerge in larger settlements. The accumulation of wealth became increasingly important for maintaining social status and political influence. However, these changes also created new forms of inequality and debt that could devastate families and communities. The emergence of distinct regional identities within Norway reflected both geographic and cultural factors. Coastal communities developed differently from inland agricultural settlements. Northern regions maintained stronger connections to traditional practices than southern areas influenced by European contact. These regional differences created challenges for rulers attempting to unify the country under single laws and customs. Local dialects and cultural practices persisted despite efforts at standardization and centralization. The influence of climate fluctuations on Norwegian society became increasingly apparent. Periods of warmer weather allowed for expanded agriculture and population growth. Colder cycles led to crop failures, famine, and increased political instability. Changes in sea temperature affected fish populations and migration patterns, impacting coastal communities. The inability to predict or control these environmental changes made long-term planning extremely difficult for Norwegian leaders. The gradual transition from oral to written culture had far-reaching implications for Norwegian society. Legal codes, once memorized by specialists, began to be written down and standardized. Religious texts introduced new concepts and stories that competed with traditional Norse mythology. Administrative records allowed for more efficient taxation and resource management. However, the dominance of Latin as the written language created barriers for those who could not read, effectively excluding most of the population from written knowledge. The evolution of Norwegian architecture reflected both practical needs and cultural aspirations. The development of mast churches demonstrated sophisticated woodworking techniques and artistic vision. Secular buildings began to incorporate decorative elements that displayed wealth and status. The use of stone in construction increased, though it remained primarily associated with religious and defensive structures. These architectural innovations required specialized knowledge and skilled craftsmen, contributing to social stratification based on technical expertise. The relationship between Norwegian Vikings and their environment became increasingly complex. Intensive farming and animal husbandry began to show signs of environmental impact. Overhunting of certain animals led to local extinctions and changed ecosystem dynamics. Deforestation for shipbuilding and fuel created bare hillsides prone to erosion. These environmental changes forced communities to adapt their practices and sometimes relocate to new areas. Gradually, as the centuries rolled forward, and the political landscape of Viking Norway continued to evolve under the pressures of external influences and internal consolidation. King Harald Fairhair's attempts to unify the country under a single crown met with varying degrees of success and resistance across different regions. Local jarls, accustomed to independence, found themselves caught between submission to a distant king and the preservation of their traditional authority over their territories. These political struggles shaped the daily lives of ordinary Norwegians, who often found themselves caught between competing loyalties and changing allegiances. The increasing influence of Christianity brought about fundamental changes to Norwegian social customs and practices. The Old Norse practice of exposing unwanted infants on hillsides was gradually replaced by Christian teachings about the sanctity of life. Polygamy, once accepted among the wealthy elite, became increasingly controversial as Christian monogamy gained acceptance. The role of the pagan priestesses, who had wielded considerable influence in traditional Norse religion, diminished as male Christian clergy assumed religious authority. These changes often created generational divides within families, as younger members embraced new beliefs while elders clung to traditional ways. The establishment of Norway's first cities marked a significant departure from the rural, farm-based society that had characterized earlier Viking culture. Bergen emerged as a major trading hub, its strategic location allowing merchants to take advantage of both inland and coastal trade routes. Nidaros, later known as Trondheim, developed around its cathedral and became a centre of religious and political power. These urban centres attracted craftsmen, merchants and labourers, creating more diverse and complex social structures than those found in rural areas. However, the majority of Norwegians still lived on isolated farms, and city life remained alien to most of the population. The technological innovations of the late Viking period transformed many aspects of daily life. The introduction of the wheeled plough revolutionized agriculture, allowing farmers to work heavier soils more efficiently. Improved methods of iron production led to better tools and weapons, giving Norwegian craftsmen a competitive advantage in trade. The development of more sophisticated navigation instruments enabled longer and more accurate sea voyages. Yet these advances spread slowly through Norwegian society, and many communities continue to rely on traditional methods for generations. The evolution of Norwegian law during this period reflected the tension between customary practices and external influences. The Gulating and Frostathing laws attempted to codify traditional Norwegian legal practices while incorporating Christian principles of justice. Punishments for crimes began to shift from compensation-based systems to more punitive measures influenced by continental European practices. The concept of royal law began to supersede local customs, though enforcement remained inconsistent across the kingdom. These legal changes often favoured the wealthy and educated, who could better navigate the increasingly complex system of written laws. The transformation of Norwegian military organisation had profound implications for society. The traditional militia system, where free farmers served as warriors when needed, gradually gave way to more professional military forces. The establishment of royal bodyguards and professional soldiers created a new military class separate from the general population. Fortified royal residences and strategic forts required permanent garrisons, further professionalising military service. These changes reduced the autonomy of local leaders and increased the power of the monarchy, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Norwegian society. The introduction of formal education systems, though limited, began to create new intellectual classes within Norwegian society. Cathedral schools offered basic education to future clergy, teaching Latin, arithmetic, and religious doctrine. Some wealthy families began sending their children to continental European centres of learning, bringing back new ideas and perspectives. The establishment of scriptoriums for copying manuscripts created a small but important class of scribes and scholars. However, literacy remained confined to a tiny elite, with the vast majority of Norwegians remaining entirely oral in their learning and communication. Women's roles in late Viking Norway reflected the complex interplay between traditional customs and changing religious and social norms. While women retained many legal rights, including the ability to own property and request divorces, Christian influence began to restrict some of their traditional freedoms. The rise of monasteries provided new opportunities for religious women, but also created pressure for others to adopt more restricted lifestyles. Elite women continued to wield significant influence through their control of household resources and their roles in diplomatic marriages. However, the increasing emphasis on male primogeniture in inheritance practices gradually reduced women's economic independence. The artistic achievements of late Viking Norway demonstrated both continuity with earlier traditions and openness to foreign influences. Stone churches featured elaborate carvings that blended Christian symbolism with traditional Norse design elements. Metalworkers created increasingly sophisticated jewellery and decorative objects, incorporating techniques learned from Byzantine and Islamic craftsmen. The development of illuminated manuscripts combined Norse artistic traditions with continental European styles. These artistic innovations served both religious and secular purposes, decorating churches while also displaying the wealth and sophistication of Norwegian elites. The changing nature of agriculture in Viking Norway reflected both technological advances and environmental pressures. The expansion of cultivated land reached its practical limits, forcing communities to develop more intensive farming methods. The introduction of new crops and improved livestock breeds increased productivity but required significant initial investments. Specialized agricultural regions began to emerge, with some areas focusing on grain production, while others emphasized livestock or dairy farming. These changes created new forms of interdependence between regions and contributed to the growth of internal trade networks. The development of more sophisticated cooking techniques and food preservation methods improved the Norwegian diet during this period. The introduction of new spices through trade routes added variety and flavour to traditional dishes. Improved brewing methods produced higher quality ale and mead, which remained important sources of calories and nutrition. The establishment of monastic gardens introduced new vegetables and fruits to Norwegian agriculture. However, these improvements primarily benefited the wealthy, while common people continued to survive on simple, monotonous diets for much of the year. The merchant class in Norwegian society gained increasing prominence and influence during this period. Successful traders accumulated wealth that rivaled that of traditional landowning elites, challenging established social hierarchies. The development of merchant guilds provided these traders with political influence and protection for their commercial interests. International trade connections brought Norwegian merchants into contact with diverse cultures and ideas, broadening their worldview. However, the risks of long-distance trade remained high, and many merchant fortunes were lost to storms, pirates, or political upheavals. The relationship between Norway and its Scandinavian neighbours became increasingly complex as the Viking Age progressed. Dynastic marriages created alliances and conflicts that transcended national boundaries. Competing claims to territories and trade routes led to ongoing warfare between Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish forces. Cultural exchanges continued despite political tensions, with craftsmen, scholars, and merchants moving freely between kingdoms. The dream of Scandinavian unity remained elusive, as regional differences and political ambitions prevented lasting cooperation. The evolution of religious architecture during this period created some of Norway's most impressive and enduring monuments. Stave churches, with their distinctive wooden architecture, developed as a uniquely Norwegian contribution to medieval church design. The construction of stone cathedrals required importing skilled masons and architects from continental Europe. These religious buildings served not only as places of worship but also as symbols of power and centres of community life. The decoration of these churches with intricate carvings and metalwork created opportunities for local artisans to develop new skills and styles. The impact of disease and demographic changes on Norwegian society cannot be understated. Periodic epidemics swept through communities, killing large numbers and disrupting social structures. The gradual population growth of the Viking period led to increased competition for resources and land. Migration to Iceland, Greenland, and other territories provided outlets for excess population, but also drained Norway of skilled individuals. These demographic pressures contributed to social tensions and political instability throughout the period. The development of more complex financial systems began to transform economic relationships within Norwegian society. The use of standardized weights and measures for silver made trade more efficient and less prone to disputes. Early forms of credit and banking emerged, allowing merchants to finance larger trading ventures. The concept of rent and tenancy began to replace earlier forms of land tenure, creating new relationships between landowners and workers. These financial innovations increased economic efficiency, but also created new forms of debt and dependency that could trap individuals and families in poverty. The transformation of traditional Norwegian festivals and celebrations reflected the ongoing cultural change. Ancient seasonal celebrations like Yule were gradually merged with Christian holidays like Christmas. Wedding ceremonies began to incorporate both pagan and Christian elements, creating unique Norwegian traditions. Funeral practices evolved to include Christian burial customs, while retaining some traditional elements. These hybrid celebrations helped ease the transition between old and new beliefs, but also created confusion about proper religious observance. The role of language in Norwegian society underwent significant changes during this period. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, began to divide into distinct regional dialects. Latin became the language of the church and educated elite, creating a barrier between clergy and lay people. Written Norwegian emerged slowly, primarily for legal and administrative purposes. These linguistic changes reflected and reinforced social divisions within Norwegian society. The evolution of craft specialization created new social roles and hierarchies within Norwegian communities. Master craftsmen began to employ apprentices and journeymen, creating structured learning hierarchies. The development of specialized tools and techniques required longer periods of training and higher levels of skill. Competition between craftsmen led to improvements in quality, but also to trade secrets and guild restrictions. These changes made crafted goods more expensive and less accessible to common people, increasing social stratification. The final phases of the Viking Age in Norway saw the emergence of a more centralized and Christianized kingdom. The reign of King Olaf II, later Saint Olaf, marked a decisive turn toward Christian governance and law. The establishment of administrative systems based on continental models reduced the autonomy of local leaders. The suppression of pagan practices and the destruction of traditional religious sites symbolized the end of Old Norse religion. These changes, while often imposed by force, gradually gained acceptance as new generations grew up within the Christian social order. The influence of foreign architectural styles began to appear throughout Norway during this period. Romanesque architecture, imported from continental Europe, influenced the design of churches and secular buildings. The use of stone vaulting and flying buttresses allowed for larger and more impressive structures. Decorative elements borrowed from various European traditions created a unique Norwegian architectural hybrid. However, these foreign styles were expensive to implement and remained largely confined to religious and royal buildings. The legacy of the Viking Age continued to influence Norwegian culture long after the period officially ended. Traditional crafts and artistic styles persisted, adapting to new religious and social contexts. The legal principles and social structures established during the Viking period formed the foundation for later Norwegian institutions. Stories and legends from the Viking era were preserved in sagas and oral traditions, shaping Norwegian cultural identity. The maritime skills and exploration spirit of the Vikings continued to characterize Norwegian society for centuries to come. Environmental changes during the late Viking period had lasting consequences for Norwegian society. Deforestation and intensive farming led to soil erosion and changes in local climates. The Little Ice Age began to affect Scandinavia, making agriculture more difficult and winters harsher. Changes in fish populations forced coastal communities to adapt their fishing practices and explore new waters. These environmental challenges required innovative responses and contributed to the development of more sustainable practices. The transformation of Norwegian music and literature reflected the cultural changes of the period. Traditional Norse poetry evolved to incorporate Christian themes while maintaining its distinctive meter and style. New musical instruments and styles were introduced through contact with other cultures. The preservation of traditional stories in written form began during this period, though many were altered to fit Christian sensibilities. These cultural developments created a unique Norwegian literary and musical tradition that would influence later generations. The development of more sophisticated medicinal practices reflected both traditional knowledge and new influences. Monastic infirmaries began to systematize the treatment of illness and injury. The translation of Arabic and Greek medical texts introduced new ideas about anatomy and disease. Herbal medicine continued to evolve, with new plants and preparations being discovered through trade. However, medical knowledge remained limited, and many conditions that are easily treatable today remained fatal in medieval Norway. The role of the church in Norwegian society extended far beyond religious matters. Monasteries became centres of learning, preserving both Christian and secular knowledge. The church provided social services, including care for the poor, sick and elderly. Ecclesiastical courts handled many legal matters, particularly those related to marriage and family relationships. The accumulation of land and wealth by religious institutions created new centres of power that sometimes competed with secular authorities. The evolution of trade networks during the late Viking period connected Norway to an increasingly globalised medieval world. Regular trade relations were established with England, France and other European kingdoms. Norwegian products, particularly fish, furs and amber, found steady markets throughout Europe. The import of luxury goods and raw materials enabled the development of new crafts and industries. These trade connections also facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies and cultural practices. The growing importance of written contracts and documents changed how Norwegians conducted business and legal affairs. Land transactions began to be recorded in writing, reducing disputes over property rights. Marriage contracts became more elaborate, clearly defining the rights and obligations of both parties. Trade agreements were formalised in written documents, making commerce more predictable and secure. However, the reliance on written documents disadvantaged those who could not read or write, further entrenching social inequalities. Technological innovations in shipbuilding reached new heights during the final Viking period. The development of larger, more stable vessels enabled longer voyages and increased cargo capacity. Improvements in sail design and rigging made ships more efficient in various wind conditions. The construction of specialised vessels for different purposes, such as trading ships and warships, reflected the growing complexity of maritime activities. These advances maintained Norway's reputation as a leading maritime power well beyond the Viking Age. The social mobility that had characterised early Viking society gradually diminished as hierarchies became more entrenched. Hereditary nobility gained greater privilege and power, making it harder for ordinary individuals to rise in social status. The accumulation of land and wealth in fewer hands created sharper distinctions between rich and poor. Professional specialisation reduced the independence of individual farmers and craftsmen. These changes created a more stratified society that would characterise medieval Norway for centuries. The philosophical and intellectual developments of the period reflected the synthesis of different cultural traditions. Norse wisdom traditions merged with Christian theology to create unique perspectives on life and death. The introduction of Latin learning brought new ways of thinking about law, medicine, and natural phenomena. However, the limited spread of literacy meant that these intellectual developments affected only a small elite. Oral traditions remained the primary means of transmitting knowledge for most Norwegians. The final transformation of the Viking warrior culture marked the end of an era. The image of the independent warrior farmer gave way to that of the loyal subject and Christian knight. Military service became more organised and hierarchical, with clear chains of command and professional standards. The old ideals of personal honour and revenge were replaced by Christian concepts of duty and service. This cultural shift symbolised the broader transformation of Norwegian society from Viking to medieval. As our journey through Viking Norway comes to a close, I hope this exploration has helped ease your mind and guide you toward peaceful sleep. History's gentle rhythms continue to flow, just as they have for countless generations before us. The story of Viking Norway reminds us that even the most dramatic periods of history were made up of countless ordinary days, filled with the simple tasks of survival, the bonds of family and community, and the quiet moments between the great events that historians record. In the kitchens where women ground grain by hand, on the farms where men struggled against harsh weather to grow enough food for winter, and in the workshops where craftsmen patiently shaped metal and wood, life continued with its own rhythms and purposes. These ancient Norwegians faced challenges that dwarf our modern inconveniences. They lived without central heating in climates that could kill, preserved food without refrigeration, and navigated vast oceans without modern instruments. Yet they not only survived, but created a culture whose influence spread across continents and whose stories still captivate us today. Perhaps there's something oddly comforting in contemplating these long-ago struggles and triumphs. Their world was harsh, but it was also simple in ways ours is not. Their concerns were immediate and concrete: staying warm, finding food, protecting family, maintaining honour. Their solutions required ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience, qualities that remain admirable regardless of the centuries that separate us from them. If this boring historical narrative has helped you find rest tonight, remember that your like and subscription directly support our mission to create more of these sleep-inducing histories. Your engagement helps other insomniacs discover these narratives too. What historical period would you like us to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. Until next time, good night and pleasant dreams.